See, we all know that the directors, board of directors of a company, they are majorly responsible for taking any kind of financial decisions. And the board of directors are typically elected by the shareholders, and they are expected to behave or to take decisions in the interest of the shareholders. But majorly what they will be doing is they will delegate their responsibilities, especially for small and medium kind of decisions. They will delegate the decisions to the executives who are typically hired, who are typically hired, and this is where creates creates the separation of ownership and control. Ownership probably is with the board of directors who are representing the shareholders. Control now is in the hands of executives who are appointed to take the decision. Now, on one side, this could be an advantageous thing. This could be beneficial also because, first of all, now the ownership of the firm is separated from the regular operations of the firm. Correct? Which means even if the ownership changes, the operations of the firm need not be affected. So that's an advantage. Probably this company's owners might change and a new owner can come out, but the typical operations of the company can still continue, which means there is a very comfort in terms of changing of ownership. And we are also bringing the professionals who are really experts in that particular space to manage the day-to-day operations. So it's giving a more of a professional flavor to the business. Owners who might be having capital with them, who have funded the business, may not be aware of the better way of running it. So a professional way can typically come out into the running of the business, but at the same time the conflict of interest between the owners and the shareholders is a very common scenario that can occur because of this kind of separation of ownership and the control part. And the traditional conflicts of interest which we see in many organizations, one between the shareholders who are the owners of the business and the managers who have been hired by the board of directors to execute the day-to-day decisions. Because there is a lot of possibility that the managers have a lot of information about the working of the company, lot of knowledge, and are very heavily capable of taking influential decisions. So they may be very heavily motivated by those kind of decisions which can really benefit them rather than working in the interests of the shareholders. They may try to take the decisions which are working in their favor rather than in the interests of the shareholders. So it's a very common conflict that is very much possible. It has to be resolved in some form or the other. Otherwise, the growth of the company will get hampered. Similarly, we see some more possibilities of conflicts. Let's say between shareholders and lenders, the other set of stakeholders in the firm. Now, if we see this, shareholders are providing equity capital to the business, but the lenders are providing the debt capital to the business. Now, the lenders would be more and more looking out for security of the company, because they are more targeted to see whether this company can pay their interest and principal on time. So every year when the interest falls due, they should be in a position to pay, which means they are slightly against a company taking a long term perspective. The long term risk taking, something do not go with the lenders. They are preferring more and more security, whereas the shareholders feel the company should really look at long term perspective, invest in some exclusive projects, even though if they are risky, if they are expected to generate high returns, probably high NPV projects, invest in them, and probably look at the overall development of the company so that they get more and more. The more the profit the company is able to make, their share of profit is increasing. So on one side, lenders are more looking at security and a short-term perspective, whereas on the other side, shareholders are looking at a longer-term perspective and probably a slightly more risk-taking scenario from the company. Which means the shareholders, who are the typical owners of the company, they have conflicts of interest with a very different set of other stakeholders of the firm. One, the executives, which we have already seen about, and along with that, even with the lenders, and probably if I start exploring, I could see that they have conflicting objectives even with the government, various other scenarios as well. So that is where all these conflicts really need to be handled, really need to be managed effectively, so that the overall performance of the company is not deteriorated. And this is where we'll try to bring in what we call as the agency theory. What is the package that this agency theory is bringing in? It is talking about the relationship between the principal, who is the owner of the company, and the agent, who has been hired by the shareholders, who has been hired by the principal to act on the behalf of the principal. Now, in this, when there is any kind of conflict of interest between these two parties, there are so many costs that are involved, which are typically called as agency costs. Probably once this conflict of interest comes out, the company may be or the principal or the shareholders may be involved more and more in terms of monitoring the actions of the agents or the executives. So there's a lot of time, money, effort goes in terms of monitoring, and trying to put more and more pressure on the executives to implement their opinions. So everything costs more and more to the company, right? And probably again, if the managers are not acting on the interests of the shareholders, again the consequences of the management not acting in the behalf of the shareholders could even result in some amount of rework, some amount of repairs, lot of additional costs that could come up. So there are a huge costs that are involved. So the agency theory focuses on trying to understand the various kinds of costs. What are the different kinds of conflicts that are bound to happen, as we have already discussed, between shareholders and the lenders, shareholders and the managers. So there could be different groups of conflict, and what are the ways? In some cases, these conflicts can be resolved using a carrot, and in some cases a stick might be required, and in some cases the combination of both might be required. So even it talks about how can typically these results, these conflicts be resolved, either by going towards and finally what is that can be done for motivating the agent and incentivizing the agent so that finally he acts in the better interests of the principal. So it can come between various stakeholders. Probably there could be a senior management versus a junior management, customer, supplier, every place there is a possibility of the conflict of interest to occur. When we look at on a broader aspect, the resolution of this, it would have been more and more easy if the information is equally shared across by all the parties. If every party interprets the information about the progress of the company in a similar manner, there is no question of the conflict, and even if the conflict comes, it can be resolved very easily. But what we see is there is a lot of asymmetry in the process. Probably we could very clearly see that the management of a company has more understanding about the prospects of the company compared to a shareholder who may not be involved in the day-to-day activities of the company. Any new project the company is going to benefit with, the management is going to have much more clear understanding, whereas the regular shareholder may not have much of an understanding on the same. So the information asymmetry plays a very important role in creating the conflicts between the various sets of stakeholders. Now, there is one thing that is proposed. Probably there could be different kinds of agreements in place between the various classes of stakeholders, which talks about what is the relationship between them, right? It should clearly mention the agreement between them. It should clearly talk about the relationship between them, and along with that, it may not be a formal, even an informal kind of a relationship building should really work out so that this kind of information asymmetry can be typically avoided. Now, this is where probably a contractual theory plays an important role. What is this contractual theory talking about? Now, think of the organization as a chain of contracts or as a network of contracts. Some contracts are physical, actual contracts, and some of them are implicit. Now, each contract will clearly specify the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders in the organization. Right? Each contract, the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders in the organization is mentioned, and their rights, obligations, what do they pay off in what circumstances, that entire thing is clearly defined. But again here what we typically see is majority of these, probably if I start looking at different kinds of stakeholders, okay, there are shareholders, let's just look at, there are shareholders, there are lenders, there are top management or senior executives, there are regular employees, right? Then we are looking at customers, suppliers. Now look at all these various stakeholders. Right now, even though I have different kinds of agreements in place, all that stuff, majority of the participants in this list, except for these set of people, they have a bargain for limited risk. They are not interested in taking any kind of a risk. They want a fixed payoffs. Look at almost all of them. Lenders, they want a fixed amount to be paid. Employees, they want their salaries to be fixed. Probably on 31st of March, salaries have to be deposited, or probably the last working day of every month, they want their salaries to be deposited. So they are limited risk taker. Suppliers, they want some kind of an agreement that the payment would be done for them by this particular point in time. So what we are looking at is all these parties, they are targeted towards limited risk, fixed payoff, whereas these set of people, the shareholders, they are primarily exposed to the residual risk. And if something is left, they are going to get it. If something is not left, they can't get anything out of it. So they are having a residual claim, and whatever they are going to really gain is after paying the fixed payoffs to all these parties. Now, this is where, in their motive, in their intention, they would typically go for the firm to take more risk. Because if the firm is going for taking more and more risk, this is going to benefit them because there is a possibility of a higher return. Higher risk, there is some possibility of a higher return. Of course, there is a downside that they are going to lose. But anyhow, if they are going to lose, there is some possibility that when the company loses, they won't get anything. So they are already prepared for it. So they want to go for a hit. In case the company is taking more risk, because there is some probability that the company can be successful and it can get a higher return, and after paying off the fixed returns to all this, they would be left with a very high amount which would add to their profitability. But at the same time, the lenders will try to see that the firm does not take more risk. Because if the risky investment fails, the security of the lenders, initially they were very highly secured, but now if the company has taken more risk, there is a high chance that they may fail more compared to the earlier scenario. So the security for the lenders is going to reduce now, while the equity investors are more and more happy about it. From the debt investors' perspective, their security is going to get reduced, which means the debt value is going to go down because of this. So there should be a mechanism where the firm gives some kind of strong assurance to the lenders that they are not going to alter their risk profile as long as the bond is still in place. Until the expiration date of the bond, they are not going to alter their risk profile in such a way that it causes the disadvantage to the lenders. And in case it happens, because the risk is getting increased more, they have to pay a higher interest rate as such. Now, this is again a kind of a conflict of interest that can come up. So it has to be very well handled. Again, the agreement can clearly mention that the company would definitely not alter its risk tolerance or risk levels so that the value of the bondholders get badly impacted. That would be mentioned as a part of the agreement that could exist between the shareholders and the bondholders. Similarly, we could also see another dimension, which is the social responsibility, because the companies typically are developing new products, employing more people, using new technologies, but it has to make sure that the society is not getting badly impacted through the various externalities that are getting created through this process, right? Because the externality is more relating to the pollution. So the company should really be looking at whether any of their activities or actions really impacting the external environment, the safety of the workers, any of them really getting impacted, the company has to really make an agreement or an arrangement to make sure that the relationship between the shareholders and these set of external environment is also not badly distorted. So overall, there are possibilities of various conflicts of interest that can come as a part of the business objectives. The interesting part is how do we understand all these various objectives, and how does the company come forward in terms of addressing all these objectives and resolving the various conflicts of interest that can come out at various stages becomes the importance of the efficient management in an organization, right?